All right, good morning, everyone. On the phone, we have at present 162 individuals, in addition to about 10 or 15 here in the Water Congress office here. Welcome to the Drought Contingency Planning webinar in the Colorado River Basin. Everyone that's been joining has generally been on mute. As others join in, we'll have to continue to mute others as they come on. I understand we're not going to be taking any questions. Assuming the technology works, we are recording this, so this will be posted and available for posting later. With that, I'm going to turn it over to James Eklund, and James, take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Doug. Just want to make sure that you are thanked appropriately for hosting us. Really appreciate Colorado Water Congress continuing to be an amazing voice for messages and information and the discussion that takes place in the Colorado water community. So thank you for doing that. Good news to report from the Colorado River Basin. We have, after many years really of discussions and negotiations, a real milestone that we've reached to announce today. We have a number of agreements, a package of agreements that we're going to go through in detail on this webinar, and we're going to figure out ways that we're going to tell you ways that you can ask questions, make your comments or observations known to the state and to the rest of the water community in Colorado at the end of this webinar. I will stay on this slide for just a second, Doug, before pivoting to our kind of run of show and give you an idea of what the agenda is for the day or for the call. In a system that supports 40 million people and constitutes the world's fifth largest economy, failure is not an option, is the quote that comes to mind. And that if you were following Colorado's water plan, the quote was used frequently. It was originally from Gene Kranz, the Apollo mission commander, talking about getting to the moon safely and returning humans to Earth. We are in a very dire situation in the Colorado River Basin. It could be more dire if the snowpack this year looks like last water year's snowpack, and we have to be ready to respond to that. I'll go ahead and go to the next slide, Doug, and we can kind of go through what we're going to do on this webinar. We've got drought contingency planning that will be generally introduced to you as a concept, and we can go over what led to us getting to today and why we're here. Then we'll have the legal context laid out to you with Karen Kwan from the Colorado Attorney General's office, who's been immersed in all of this discussion and negotiation with a drafting group that has helped put together the package of agreements that we'll be talking about. And we also have current conditions that we'll review where we are with the system as we sit today. If you're flying into Las Vegas anytime soon, you expect to continue to see that bathtub ring. And if you were lucky enough to fly over Lake Powell, you would see the same thing. Our system is less than half full, and we are in a condition that everyone should be paying attention, or as many people we hope as possible, especially Coloradans, pay attention to the current conditions. Then we'll go to the drought contingency plans themselves. This morning I was on the way over here and I heard a little radio piece on KUNC by Luke Runyon, and he said it well. We refer to it as drought contingency plans here, but you could really replace drought with climate. We are probably in a new normal on this system, and it doesn't do us any good to think that we're just going to get bailed out by hydrology in the next coming years, and we certainly can't plan for that to happen. So drought contingency plans in the upper basin, drought contingency plans in the lower basin, and then a current tentative timeline. And I'm getting a little echo, but are we good? Okay. A current tentative timeline for what you can expect to happen on this system. We'll walk through that too in some detail. So I will say that the map you see up there, probably most people on this webinar are very familiar with that map. It constitutes the Colorado River's geographic basin and hydrogeologic basin, but it does not constitute the legal basin. The entirety of that basin actually covers the entire state of Colorado for all intents and purposes, because of all the trans-mountain diversions that move water out of this basin to the east, but it also moves water to the west out of the basin into the metropolitan area of Southern California. So we have big parts of the country, well-populated parts of the country, that are covered by this basin, and as I alluded to at the start of this webinar, they are really fed by and are dependent on this river system. So the lower basin, we're in the, I'll just say, we're in the worst hydrologic period in recorded human history, and you have to go back in the paleo hydrology back like 1,200 years to find a suite of 15 to 20 year periods that are as bad as the one we're in right now. So the lower basin states, and those are California, Nevada, and Arizona on the map there, they began responding to declining levels at Lake Mead. Just like your bank account, if you pull more water out of, or money out of your account than comes into it on a monthly or annual basis, you're going to run a deficit. And that's where we are at Lake Mead. So the lower basin states saw that dynamic and decided we better start talking about increasing the flexibility and the encouraging the frequency of water to be banked in Lake Mead, and how we take it out. They want to make sure that their system is functioning properly. In Colorado, just to give you some context, we get pretty nervous. I know Karen and Becky and water managers around the state that are on this webinar get pretty nervous and start wringing our hands if we're around 60% average snowpack. And in 2015, California's statewide snowpack was 3%. So your systems don't operate or function when that happens. And as a result, if you're in those conditions like California was in 2015, you empty all of your storage over the course of the year to avert the crisis, or at least mitigate it. So there were a bunch of empty storage vessels in California, and the Californians had a decision to make. Do they bank water in Lake Mead to pull out at a future date, or do they put it in the vessels that they control and have complete dominion and control over in their own state? There was no incentive for them to keep it in Lake Mead, even though keeping it in Lake Mead would have absolutely helped and benefited the entire Colorado River system. So they started discussing amongst their neighbors, Arizona and Nevada in particular, how they might create operations of Lake Mead in a way, and shortage sharing at Lake Mead in a way that would allow them to keep water in Mead and give them some certainty that they would be able to pull it out. That's why they really started having these conversations in earnest a few years ago, and looking at the modeling right along with us in the upper basin states. Your state, Colorado, is the supply of over 70% of the flow of the Colorado River. So it matters a great deal to our state, and it matters a great deal to our neighbors. Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico constitute the upper division states, and we are working with them. We began modeling Lake Powell levels. You can think of Lake Powell as our bucket on that map that you're looking at. It's really our insurance policy provides a secure, certain amount of water past the compact point, which is Lee Ferry, Arizona. And that compact point, we are required to not deplete the flow of the river below 75 million acre feet in any 10-year period. That means that we have Lake Powell sitting right up above that compact point, and we can meter water out to comply with the compact. That's great. We are well and above 90 million acre feet in the last 10-year period of record. Again, the requirement is 75 million acre feet over a 10-year running average. We're well above that right now, but if the level of Lake Powell falls below what we call the elevation minimum power pool, if we go below that point, then we have a problem. And the problem there is threefold. One, we can't turn the turbines to to produce hydroelectric power that supplies supplies power to many of the rural electric associations that probably many people on this webinar get their electricity from. But it also means that we can't expect to see the revenue that's generated from the sale of that power benefiting our endangered species recovery programs and our salinity control programs that depend on that money coming back to us to support those programs from the U.S. Treasury. So that is a dynamic that we don't want to see. That's the second thing that happens if you go below minimum power. And the third thing that happens is you can't get more than 5 million acre feet or so out of the reservoir on an annual basis. Well, I was told when I went to law school that there would be no math, but if you do the division that even I can do, 75 million divided by 10, you've got 7.5 million acre feet every year that you have to make sure, or thereabouts, that pass that compact point. And what we in the Upper Basin have done is modeled the system, and if you can only get 5 million acre feet out of your large storage bucket, Lake Powell, on an annual basis, you start to erode that insurance policy that reservoir represents to us. So we needed to develop some tools to respond to that condition that would bend the curve. We use that term because when we looked at the modeling and we saw the likelihood, the percentage likelihood that we would go below minimum power, we needed a way to make sure that we didn't drop below that elevation. And so we started discussing how we would respond and what those tools would look like. A couple of tools that we developed and that many of you, if not most of you, or all of you on this webinar have heard about before, either at Colorado Water Congress events or just out in your districts or in the water community in general. The two tools that we've developed are, first, we need to be able to operate the reservoirs that sit above Lake Powell. And the big ones, the Colorado River Storage Project units that sit up above Lake Powell are Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, and Navajo. Those three units are large bodies of water storage, and they can, if we release water in a strategic way, we can alleviate a problem at Lake Powell to some extent. We won't be able to bend the curve satisfactorily just doing that, though. We've got to do more. And so the next tool that we've developed and we've been talking about is creating an account in Lake Powell that would allow us to conserve water in the Upper Basin and send that water down to help bend the curve. So we've got these two tools, and then of course we've also been utilizing a number of other tools. Some are well known to people on this webinar. We've got weather modification with cloud seeding, and we've also got phreatophyte removal. So we've had a notion and some tools at our disposal that we might need to deploy on this system to try and bend that curve. But it really wasn't until a couple of years ago that we realized how acute the situation had become and how bad it could get if we had back-to-back poor water years. And that's where we sit today. If we continue to have a bad water year as we have in the last year, then we're in a position that we don't want to be in, and we'll need to manage our way out of it if at all possible. So those are the two big tools. I think, Doug, if you go to the next slide, we can cover a couple of things. There it is. Okay, so we call the suite of agreements that the upper basin and the lower basin has been working on, contingency planning. Now, what is it? It says there on the slide, I think, a good definition: interstate planning for drought response to reduce risks associated with reaching critical reservoir elevations at Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The response of the 7 states and the country of Mexico to all of the bad, terrible, horrible hydrology that we have seen is really wrapped up in this contingency planning effort. It is our response, and we know that failure is not an option, and we also know that we can't sit by and do nothing. If we don't act, if we just let inertia take its course, we will not end up in the position on this river that we want to be in, and that Colorado or the upper basin or the lower basin for that matter, or Mexico wants to be in. Next slide, Doug. I think we're getting to the end of my intro, so thank you for your patience out there in webinar land. Why are we doing this? If critical reservoir elevations are breached, like I just described, the system faces threats to the ability to control our own destiny. And that's really why we decided to sign the Colorado River Compact in 1922 to begin with. And it precipitated 8 more compacts that were signed on many of our rivers in Colorado, and 2 equitable apportionment decrees with the U.S. Supreme Court that is all about us in Colorado, the headwater state, 18 downstream states in the country of Mexico getting water from our snowpack. It really, it puts a fine point on us controlling our destiny when we have those documents in place. That was the whole point. So drinking water supply, irrigation, natural resource preservation, hydropower production, economic stability, and overall system sustainability, those are what we're trying to do with this planning effort. And we're trying to protect all of those. Low probability but high risk in the upper basin. Like I said, we're 90 million acre feet plus away, we're way north of the compact requirement at Lee Ferry for the upper basin. But if we go below, if the parade of horribles that I just laid out happens, then we would face a really difficult situation with high risk to every water user, whether you're senior or junior. The entire state would be impacted by a condition like that. And so avoiding that is where we're really putting our effort. And it's high risk, like we said, low probability, but high risk. It's less than 5% possibility that we hit that spot in the next couple of years, but it's a very high, better than 50% chance that we will see a shortage declaration in the lower basin in the next 2 years. So it's low probability for us in the upper basin, but high risk. We needed a sensible plan for the worst case scenarios to avoid potential controversy, conflict, and uncertainty, and preparing for, but not predicting the need for implementation of these plans. So that's kind of where we are. You get the next slide there, Doug. So there's the Colorado River Basin. We see the 2 big reservoirs that operate the system and really control the system: Lake Mead in the lower basin and Lake Powell in the upper basin. Like I said, we've got a suite of agreements here with this contingency planning that we're doing that really sets up 2 tools that allows us to help Lake Powell when it needs it most. And we hope that that's not this year, but it's got to be something that we have planned for. We can't sit stagnant or still on. We have to move forward with this. As we put these agreements together, we realized that the efforts that the lower basin was undergoing to create some drought contingency plans really changed the operation of the 2 reservoirs. And when you do that, it's something that has to be agreed on by all 7 states and the federal government. And we wanted to make sure that the lower basin didn't feel empowered to go unilaterally change what we call the law of the river, and Karen will get into what that means, what the law of the river is, in a little more detail here in a second. But we wanted to get very clear with the lower basin that we were not in the upper basin or at the federal level going to sit by and let that happen, and that we needed to work together and collaborate on this system. The lower basin, to its credit, agrees with us on that. They have been negotiating in good faith on how the system should operate and what the tools are that we can stand up to alleviate this problem, or at least address it. The lower basin's attempt, though, really kick-started this discussion and got us into thinking about what tools in the upper basin we would need to be part of that federal legislation that will sit alongside the agreements you're going to hear about, this drought contingency planning suite of agreements. But the federal legislation that really needs to sit and ride right alongside those will give the congressional approval that is necessary in our view, and it will also give the 7 states an opportunity to send one voice with one message with one voice to the Congress that this is something that's good for the entire basin. Why is it good for the entire basin? In a nutshell, lower basin keeping more water in Lake Mead means more water stays in Lake Powell. The more water that stays in Lake Powell means the more robust and viable our insurance policy is against calls for water from the lower basin, and the overall health of the system is better if we have more water in Lake Powell. So that's the point of the drought contingency planning effort that we're engaged in. Becky Mitchell will talk here at the end of our webinar about the situation here inside the state of Colorado that is mirrored in every single one of the other states. They have to figure out how they're going to take advantage of these tools and how they're going to stand up programming that allows them to populate the accounts that we're talking about. The account at Lake Powell would be the one that we would be focused on here in Colorado with that discussion. And that's really a great place for the Colorado water community, people on this webinar, people that are following the Colorado Water Conservation Board's discussions on that intrastate planning of what a program would look like to populate that account. She'll speak to that in a little bit. But since you're probably tired of hearing my voice at this point, I'm ready to turn it over to Karen Kwan, unless either one of you ladies have seen something that I've completely missed, which is totally possible.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Awesome. Well, take it away, Karen.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. James was able to touch upon some of the elements of the law of the river, but I'm going to kind of just highlight them so that we have some context when we go through the actual elements of the drought contingency plan. So, Doug, if you go to the next slide, I think you can file through this and we'll just get to the next slide. There's a couple of things that are going to show up there, but I'll get it on the next slide. So, basically, I'm going to start with the Colorado River Compact. You can keep going, yeah. The Colorado River Compact was signed in 1922 by the 7 Colorado River Basin states and then approved by Congress in 1929. There's a lot to that small compact, but the 3 main provisions that are helpful for understanding the context of what we're talking about today are highlighted on the slide now. Article 3A is what apportions water to each of those basins. It sets the the distinction points between the basins at Lee Ferry. Above Lee Ferry is the upper basin, below Lee Ferry is the lower basin. Each basin is entitled to the exclusive beneficial use of 7.5 million acre-feet per year of water from the Colorado River system. That includes its tributaries and the main stem of the Colorado. In addition, under Article 3B, the lower basin gets an additional million acre-foot. So basically, you have 7.5 million acre-feet that the upper basin is entitled to, and 8.5 million acre-feet that the lower basin is entitled to. That's just the general apportionment. James alluded to another important clause. It's the non-depletion clause. I think some have referred to it as the hammer clause for the upper basin. That's where the upper basin cannot cause the flow at Lee Ferry to go below 75 million acre-feet over a 10-year rolling average. It's not a delivery obligation. If we didn't do something to deplete the flow and there's not 75 million acre-feet, we don't have to go find water and just put it in the river. but we do have to take action to not cause the flow to be depleted by at least 75 million acre feet over a 10-year rolling average. And James is right. We're at 91 million and change over the current 10-year rolling average. Another component is the operational provision under Article 3E. It doesn't get a lot of play, but it actually is important for understanding why we operate our reservoirs the way we do. Basically, it provides that we can't just keep water and hold it up in the upper basin if we're not needing and using it. And the lower basin at the same time can't call for water or ask for releases to be made to deliver to them if they don't have a need to use it. How that's implemented and how to accomplish that was a number of questions that we had to the states and the federal government had to understand and go through, and it's kind of outlined in the Colorado River Basin Project Act of 1968. I'm not going to go through all of the details on it, but just hold on to this concept of we can't just keep all of the water that we're not using, neither can they ask for all of the water if they're not going to use it. So Doug, next slide. Another key element to remember in apportioning water from the Colorado River is the treaty that we have with Mexico. It's the 1944 treaty. It guarantees an annual quantity of 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico. So we have 7.5 to the upper basin, 8.5 to the lower basin, and 1.5 to Mexico. I too went to law school, so my addition is not that great either on math, but it is more than the average flow right now that we have in the Colorado River Basin. I think it's 17.5 million acre feet. Now, that water that Mexico is guaranteed each year can be increased if we have a surplus, where if everybody's getting all the water and we're spilling and everything, then they can also get 200,000 acre feet more to a maximum of 1.7 million acre feet. On the opposite side, if it's really dry, if there is an extraordinary drought, it says in the treaty, then their allotment can be reduced in proportion to the reductions that are made in the United States. The treaty does not define what extraordinary drought is, so that's a fun thing to battle with Mexico on. Significantly, whatever we end up defining it as will also be applied as the definition on the Rio Grande part of this same treaty on 1944. So if the United States said, oh, it's an extraordinary drought, we're cutting back your water, Mexico, Mexico would in tandem likely say, well, it's an extraordinary drought on the lower Rio Grande and we're cutting back water to Texas. So we have to be very careful how we define that. The treaty also established the International Boundary and Water Commission, which implements the treaty. There's an element from Mexico and there's an element from the United States, and they try to implement the treaty and work with the different divisions and states to make that happen. The significant thing for our discussions today is minutes to the treaty. Minutes are basically agreements that help implement the treaty. They're agreements between the countries, and what we've needed to do in order to accomplish effective shortage sharing and drought contingency planning is to include Mexico in our discussions and enter into minutes that will help implement them. So I'll refer to that here in a little bit, but that's what we have for the Mexico Treaty. And then the other big important element of the Law of the River is the Upper Basin Compact. And that is basically after the Colorado River Compact apportioned 7.5 million acre feet to the Upper Basin, well, how do we apportion that within the Upper Basin? Article 3A of the Upper Basin Compact accomplishes that. There's a little sliver of Arizona that's in the Upper Basin, but most of it's in the Lower Basin, so we just basically said, you get 50,000 acre feet off the top and go away. We don't talk to you very much about anything else. The other states are apportioned not a specific volume of water. They're apportioned a percentage of what water would be available in the Upper Basin. There are some uncertainties associated with water availability, specifically hydrology. We're dependent on what the hydrology is. And second, we have that non-depletion clause that we have to meet. So based on that, what discerns what our availability is. Colorado gets 51.75% of that water availability, New Mexico 11.25%, Utah 23%, and Wyoming 14%. On this slide, if we have a full supply, that's how much the volume that we would be entitled to is put there. But that's a varying number based on hydrology and our obligations at Leaf Ferry. So the other key component of the Upper Basin Compact to remember is how would we accomplish getting 75 million acre feet to Leaf Ferry over a 10-year rolling average if we needed to? That's if there isn't enough hydrology, how do we not cause the flow to be depleted? That would be where we might have to curtail uses. And how that would be accomplished, at least from an upper basin perspective, a regional perspective, is kind of mapped out in Article 4 of the Upper Basin Compact. That is where the commission is responsible, the Upper Colorado River Commission is responsible for determining what volumes each state needs to come up with to meet their obligation under the compact. That is informed by a number of formulas and guidance in the compact, but they're the ones who would say, after looking at overuse and what our consumptive uses are in each state, how much each state owes to meet their obligation. It does not allow the Upper Colorado River Commission to determine how the curtailment should occur in each state. That's left up to each state's sovereign authority to determine how that would be accomplished. I said curtailment a number of times, and we're talking about drought contingency planning. I do need to highlight, we've never been in a curtailment, and if we just maintain historic hydrology from 1906 to now, we're not going to be facing a curtailment anywhere near in the near future. The problem is our historical record has not been indicative of what we've been experiencing for the last 19 years. And so we at least need to plan for, look for ways to avoid curtailment if the drought continues or worsens. So I just wanted to highlight that point as we're talking about these things. So then we have, you can go to the next slide. So there's a number of other elements that are comprised of law of the river, but that will be for another talk at another time. What's relevant to today's discussion is we've heard a lot, I think, in different roundtables and just regional discussions about guidelines, the interim guidelines, the shortage guidelines, the 2007 guidelines. And just to highlight what those are is that in 2007, the 7 states entered into an agreement with the federal government. We have a trend of being able to do this. Instead of going into litigation. It was after the 2002 severe drought that we experienced. Reservoirs, Lake Powell especially, was going down very quickly. We were upset that the lower basin, we think, were using more than they're entitled to under the compact. And we thought they needed to start taking shortages. And we, in the guidelines that we entered into, were able to accomplish that shortages would be implemented at various elevations at Lake Mead. So in Lake Mead at elevation 1075, a shortage of 333,000 acre feet would be implemented. That means Arizona and Nevada are not getting 330,000 acre feet of what they had entitled to, a total of it. At 1050, that volume of shortage goes to 417,000. And below elevation 1025, it goes up to 500,000. At the same time, it assumes Mexico would be providing additional shortage savings, and that had to be accomplished in a minute. That was minute 319 initially. Another key element of the guidelines that's actually informational for today is that those guidelines provided some flexibility for the lower basin. It created this concept of them being able to bank water in Lake Mead to access at a later time when Lake Mead conditions have improved. How do they do that? They have to intentionally create surplus. And how do they do that? They have to take extraordinary conservation measures such as fallowing or canal lining or system efficiency improvements, or take import water from outside the system, those kind of things. And they have this extra volume of conserved water that they can bank in Lake Mead. That type of water is referred to as ICS, or intentionally created surplus. That informs some of the things, if you're reading through the documents later, that's an important concept to hold on to. Another key element of the guidelines is that it specifies the coordinated operating criteria for Lake Powell and Lake Mead for the interim period. These guidelines go through 2026 and then they expire. We have to start renegotiating them soon under the guidelines starting in 2020. But between now and 2026, the reservoirs, the big reservoirs, are operated according to specific criteria to avoid, and they're intended to avoid curtailment in the upper basin and mitigate shortages in the lower basin under low water supply. You can go to the next slide. This is how the coordinated operations operate. It's crystal clear, so I'm sure there's no explanation that's necessary. What we have is that basically Lake Powell, releases from Lake Powell are accomplished based off of tier determination. There are 4 tiers in Lake Powell. There's the equalization tier, the upper elevation balancing tier, the mid-elevation balancing tier, and the lower elevation balancing tier. Depending on what elevation Lake Powell is at, and what elevation Lake Mead is at, that tier that they're in will dictate how much water we have to release on an annual basis to Lake Mead. Right now, it was 2018, and we were in the upper elevation balancing tier, and Lake Mead had the potential to be below 1075, so we had to release 9 million acre feet. Right now, Lake Powell's current elevation is at 3,593. We're not in the equalization tier, but we are still in the upper elevation balancing tier. So it depends on where Lake Mead is to determine how much we will have to release for next year. You can go to the next slide. So, James has alluded to this. I'm just going to put a finer point on it. So the problem that we face is that the drought that we're in from 2000 to now is actually drier than what we had anticipated under the 07 guidelines. So the guidelines and how we're operating are not enough to protect the crash of the system if the drought worsens or continues for a long period of time. And what do I mean by that? We had a pretty good year in water year 2017. We are a little bit above average. I think it was 110% precip. This year, this slide, I think it can now say that it is the third driest year on record. 2002 and 1979 have been drier, but 2018 is right there. And then just over the term of the drought that we've been experiencing, Powell inflows have been less than 5 million acre feet, 7 out of the last 18 years. We've only had above average inflows 5 years since 2000. And 4 of the 5 lowest years on record have occurred during this 19-year drought, with 2012 and 2013 being the driest 2 consecutive year period in recorded history. So, and we're faced with increasing demands and decreasing supply. So that's what we're faced when we know that the 2007 guidelines hydrology that we modeled was not reflecting this type of condition. So the contingency plan is intended to be somewhat of a Band-Aid on top of the 07 guidelines, so together that the 07 guidelines can continue to work again. We can go to the next slide. This is another way of showing it. It's a vertical line is 2000, and all you need to understand on this is that there are a lot of the bars above the black line are to the left of 2000, and most of the bars below the black line are to the right of 2000. That means we've been dry. We're below the average inflow, and note that the average inflow from 1988 to now is at 10.85 million acre feet, which is less than what we've apportioned under the guidelines. Under the compact. You can go to the next one. And the final way to illustrate this is to show that the dark blue bars here are the combined storage of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. In 1999, we are at 95% full. In 2018, we're at 42% full. And the unregulated inflow into Lake Powell has been vacillating back and forth. We had a good year in 2011, 147% inflow. This year we have 44%. And that just goes back to the previous slide. As you can see that a number of those are the driest that we've had on record, and we don't have very much at 100 or above in inflow. So we're below average. So the rationale and process for the drought contingency planning. As I said, the 07 guidelines have been insufficient to protect against reservoirs crashing or declining to critically low elevations if we're in the continuing drought. Over the past decade, drought has increased the risk of declining to critical reservoir elevations nearly 4-fold since implementing the 07 guidelines. If we didn't try to plan for something, we would just be twiddling our thumbs as we watch potentially the water go down. And so in 2013, we started talking about what would happen if historic drought continued. And as James alluded to, lower basin started working on their plans, and the upper basin started modeling and looking at if we needed to protect something, what should we do and how should we do it. And we started working with Mexico and the Department of Interior to help effectuate all of this. The urgency has increased due to this year's very poor hydrology, and the modeling studies of the DCPs, that's what drought contingency plans refer to by a number of the people who've been talking about it. The DCPs indicate if we're able to accomplish this when implemented, we could at least reduce the risk of reaching the critical elevations at either Lake Powell or Lake Mead. So that's the rationale for it. These are just a few quick models, and all of this is to say the top line in the green, this is Lake Powell. Before doing any drought contingency planning, the risk of going below minimum power pool at Lake Powell is the green line. Under just regular hydrology, historic hydrology, under a stress test hydrology that incorporates the current drought we're in, it's the orange line on the far right. You can see that it's about 35% risk of going to below 3490 minimum power pool. With the drought contingency plans in place for Mexico, the lower basin and the upper basin, that risk is reduced to less than 10%, probably around 5%. So that's just for Lake Powell, and there's a similar one for Lake Mead in the next slide that basically shows that the drought contingency plans do help. You can go to the next slide. So it reduces the risk of reaching critical elevation. It doesn't eliminate it. We can't predict exactly what the hydrology will be, but it definitely reduces the risk. So going to the next slide, what are the goals? Well, we basically aren't sure what our future looks like if the drought continues. So we're trying to find a way to identify additional flexibility and security in system supplies in times of ongoing drought. And in doing so, we would hope that we can control our own destiny still, avoid unilateral and uncoordinated efforts that provoke or lead to litigation or conflict, because that doesn't lead to security and certainty either. So that's the goal of the interstate contingency planning option. And here's what it is. That's the drought contingency plan. It's a series, as James alluded to, it's a series of documents and agreements that combine together to form a package that will help plan for and identify how to operate things if the drought continues. The purple ones are the lower basin drought contingency plan, and it includes a drought contingency plan agreement and an attached operational provision. The kind of oranges is also the intrastate agreements that Arizona, California, and Nevada will have to enter into in order to effectuate their drought contingency plan. And I'll get into that in a second. Then we have the upper basin drought contingency plan in green. Those are the two tools that James alluded to, the drought response operation agreement. That's operating the CRISP reservoirs, Aspinall, Flaming Gorge, and Navajo in order to maintain minimum power pool elevations at Lake Powell. And then there's the demand management storage agreement. That's the second tool that will allow us to store water or as a second line of defense if we need it to protect elevations and well, actually to protect compact compliance obligations. You'll see at the top, above everything, is this thing called the companion agreement. That's because we need an agreement that all of us are bound to. The lower basin plan is something that is involving the lower basin states, their water users, and the federal government. The upper basin plan involves the Upper Colorado River Commission and the upper division states and the federal government. We only agree to the extent that we know the terms of the lower basin's plan. We don't think they should change it, and if they do, they'd have to come back to us. But we're not bound by their terms under their agreement, and vice versa. The companion agreement makes it so we end up being bound by everything. That's where and I'll go into that a little bit, but it's kind of the bridging the gap or bringing everything together for all of the 7 states, and that's the package that would go and be informed, so we can inform Congress if we're united in going forward on this, and this is where the federal legislation can come from. So you can go to the next slide. So what do we have? We have the Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan. These are the documents that are going to be linked, if they're not already, to the CWCB's website that you'll have access to. And if they're not working on the CWCB website, they're also on the Upper Colorado River Commission website, which is UCRcommission.com. And it's there as well.
And Karen, I'll give you just a second to catch your breath because you've been doing a great job. The documents that we're referring to, that spreadsheet that was on the previous slide that has all the kind of the flow chart of different agreements, all of those agreements are at least the ones in the colors that are not the intrastate agreements. Yeah, can you go back one there, Doug? Sorry about that, thanks. The documents that are in purple and the documents that are in green are all, and the I guess that's green. I'm not sure.
This is horrible.
That green that's up at the top.
That's more green on the screen here.
Yeah. Okay. those are the agreements that are linked, as Karen alluded to, and I just got the thumbs up that they are indeed live on the Colorado Water Conservation Board website. So if you want to Google that, CWCB, you'll get to their website, and it'll be right here for you to download these if you want to follow along or read the actual language in the drafts as they sit today, which is what Karen will go into it in a way that is more understandable, I think, than just reading the documents. So stay with us on that. I also was remiss when I was talking earlier in introducing this. I mentioned all the sovereign states. We also have a number of American Indian tribes that are federally recognized, 10 at least on the Colorado River, and 2, the Ute Mountain Ute and the Southern Ute tribes have been obviously very engaged and very mindful and of the situation that we're currently in. And they've been also watching and being briefed by me on the suites of agreements that we're talking about here as we've created them. So wanted to mention the tribes because they're very important, and they've been right there at the shoulder of the states and the basin the entire time. So with that, I think I can punt it back to you if you're.
I got my water.
Ready. Okay, great.
So going to the next slide is our first tool, the first agreement. It's referred to as the Drought Response Operations Agreement. And I will insert some of the humor of this, at least from the stupid lawyer humor. Is we definitely wanted to call it Drought Response Operations Agreement and not Drought Operations Agreement, because if that's created into an acronym, it's DOA, and we don't want it to be DOA. So it's Drought, and some people call it DROA, which drives me crazy. But anyway, it's the Drought Response Operations Agreement. What we're trying to do under this agreement is conserve water in Lake Powell itself, basically try to make sure we're conserving as much as we can in Lake Powell, or move water from available supplies in Navajo Reservoir, Flaming Gorge Reservoir, or Blue Mesa Reservoir, so that we are protecting a target elevation at Lake Powell to maintain minimum power pools. By conserving water in Lake Powell or moving the water from other reservoirs, we also have a plan to be able to recover the storage if it's been moved from one of those upper crisp reservoirs. And we're trying to do this in a way that takes actions that are consistent with the existing compliance documents for Endangered Species Act or the National Environmental Policy Act or other permits, as well as contracts for water out of those facilities. So, and James has gone into this enough. I'm only going to highlight a couple of things. Why do we want to protect minimum power pool? Minimum power pool is something at like elevation 3490, but a little bit above that, we run into a problem of cavitation and breaking of infrastructure. And so we don't really know how bad it will be, even just above 3490. And we want to protect 3490 because it does provide a clean power supply for a number of interested constituents. And as James said, there's funding that is, the revenues from creating the hydropower do a lot of things. As James said, that it pays for the Endangered Species Act compliance, the NEPA compliance, Grand Canyon Protection Act compliance. Another huge thing it does, it actually pays for the operations and maintenance of those reservoirs. We can't operate the reservoirs without that funding. And we also get funding from that to do some what we call upper basin fund projects, MOA projects that have been going on to help rehabilitate infrastructure throughout the upper basin, including Colorado. And it also, if we're at that low, we don't have a huge insurance pool to be able to ensure compact compliance. What I'm trying to say here is if we don't have these revenues and we don't have a different revenue fund, we're not just worrying about future uses of water. Our existing uses of water are at threat. And we don't want to have to risk that. So that's why we've determined as an upper basin group that protecting 3490 and minimum power pool is very significant. So that's why we have that. So what are the elements of the drought contingency plans? We have, we can go to the next slide. It's basically a contract between the Secretary of the Interior and the upper division states of Wyoming, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, as signed through the Upper Colorado River Commissioners. The target elevation that we're trying to protect under this agreement is elevation 3525. If that's the elevation that provides us the cushion to make sure that we can protect minimum power pool and its infrastructure. And it's not a document that basically says, if this condition happens, we must do X, Y, and Z. It's a process document. If conditions start to come up, we agree these processes will take place to develop the system so that we can respond. And in developing that system so we can respond, it sets forth some basic foundational principles that we must follow. And I'll go through those. So the principles that were important for all of the upper division states and the federal government are listed here. We have to operate the facilities with the maximum flexibility practicable to move the water and then recover storage after the fact. We have to be able to look at all of the units. We're not just going to focus on water at Aspinall and see if it's available and move it whenever we can. We have to look at all of the units at the same time. We have to remain consistent with existing permitting and honor existing contracts. Recovery of storage is a significant part of the whole response. We're not going to just lose the storage and never get it back. We have to look at the natural resource conditions and impact to the revenue fund, the basin fund, and the electric system. And when we're determining how to act, and we do have emergency actions, that if all of the planning and all of the processes that we're into are not enough, then we can act as a last resort. There are other principles. These are just the main ones that any plan we put together in the future would have to follow. And we don't have a plan right now because we don't know what the conditions would be when needed to do that. But what we do have is a process to go through to develop that plan. The process is 5 steps there. It's a trigger for planning process based off of modeling under the minimum probable hydrologies. It's developing the plan based off of the most probable hydrologies and the likelihood of that Lake Powell reaching elevation 3525. It's conducting outreach to all of the water users and stakeholders and work groups that are interested in this as a result of the draft plan that we would be putting together with the federal government to operate the reservoirs to protect 3525. That outreach also requires us to conduct consultation with the lower division states. And then only then can the commission approve the final drought plan after taking all of the feedback back and then submit it to the secretary for approval. If the secretary doesn't approve it, then the secretary has to come back and talk to the commission and we have to figure something else out. If the secretary does approve it, then we implement that plan accordingly. So that's the drought contingency plan, or the DROA. Then we have the second tool. It's the demand management storage agreement. It's not a demand management program agreement. It's just a storage agreement. And it's the storage agreement for 2 main reasons. First of all, demand management, the concept is that we would voluntarily or willingly and intentionally conserve water for the specific purpose of having it available if needed to to maintain compact compliance under the compact, to maintain our ability to get 75 million acre feet to Lee Ferry. Well, if we're going to conserve water intentionally and voluntarily, then we want to be able to store it somewhere. And right now we don't have that ability to store it and keep it where we need to, free of charge, which costs a lot of money, or free of the fear of it being equalized or released or anything down to the lower basin under the coordinated reservoir operation. We need some security that would not happen. That's what the storage agreement is intended to do. Its purpose is to secure the ability to use unfilled storage space at Aspinall, Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and Lake Powell to promote continued compliance with compacts if the drought continues. It also provides a foundation on which the upper basin can then look and explore how to do and whether they want to do demand management programs in the upper basin. We don't have that assurance at the moment that we would have the flexibility to do that. And as I said, the need for it is that for demand management to be effective, it needs to be multi-year storage. We're not going to be able to just do it all in 1 year and send it just at that immediate time. So if we can do it incrementally, We need to store it someplace. And the water must be conserved and stored over several years to be able to make that happen. And without the storage, as I just alluded to, there's little incentive for us to as a group in the Upper Basin, to what I refer to, and maybe it's because I've been working on this for too long, but to do the brain damage necessary to figure out what a demand management program could look like in the Upper Basin. So that's the need for the storage agreement and the purpose of the storage agreement.
So Karen, on that point, the slide, I think it was slide 11 that you had with the table with the reservoir elevations at Lake Powell driving what the releases would be. Is there anything in the 07 guidelines or the current state of affairs as we sit today that would protect water if we were to conserve it and send it down to Lake Powell? Or would that potentially be water that would be counted as in that equation and sent down to Lake Mead?
It's the latter, absolutely. And some of you on the webinar might be familiar with the phrase System Conservation Pilot Program, which we have instituted or had instituted in the past to kind of look and examine some of the ways to conserve water and add it to the system. And it was added to the system, and then it's sent to the reservoirs, and it's operated, and it's just a volume of water that's looked at when you're looking at the elevations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead of how much water should go down to Lake Mead. So that's a long-winded way of saying, if we don't have this added storage agreement, we would be only conserving water that would be subject to release to the lower basin based off of conditions at the reservoir.
So that's a critical point, Colorado, that if we do nothing and we continue to operate as we sit today, we will not have the ability to protect that water if we do indeed create it and send it down to Lake Powell. How we create that water and the contours, the details of that, something that Becky can talk about here in a little bit, but I want to make sure that we drive that point home, because that's a really critical tool that we've been focusing on and working hard to get the lower basin to agree to. And here we are. We've got a suite of agreements that they have indeed agreed to, and we are on the path to getting this win for the Upper Basin and the state of Colorado. So I just wanted to draw some attention to that, and with that, keep going.
Okay. So there's two elements to the demand management storage agreement. There's the authorization piece and there's the agreement piece. The authorization is what we need from the federal government to authorize us to be able to have this storage space. It's the authorization that would secure the Secretary's authority to allow storage at the CRISPR initial units, Aspinall, Flaming Gorge, and Navajo, to the storage of water conserved as part of an Upper Basin demand management program. It ensures that storage would be allowed with no charge in the Upper Basin. And it does not sunset. Once we get this authorization, it just continues on. It's not something that's terminated like the rest of the Lower Basin or the Upper Basin agreements terms are ending in 2026. The agreement part of this is what was needed for the Lower Basin to feel, and Upper Basin entities to feel comfortable with securing the storage in this manner. It sets forth the minimum parameters under which the Upper Division states could maybe access this authorized storage space if and when we have a demand management storage program. The red elements are important. Neither element of the demand management storage agreement mandates, guarantees, or authorizes that an Upper Basin demand management program will be instituted. We still have to look at the feasibility, investigate and work out with all of our water users how this would look, whether it's a good idea or not, and nothing in the storage agreement requires us to have the demand management program. It's only if we want to use storage space, we have to have a demand management program. So it sets the requirements for the Upper Basin demand management program before the Upper Division states can access the storage, as I just said. So if we get it authorized, how does the Upper Basin access that storage? Well, first we're going to have to meet a number of conditions. And I need to be clear, to approve the program, the Upper Division states through the commission must first determine that the program is a demand management is feasible. That's a big question. New Mexico is how they're working, and Utah how they're working, and Wyoming how they're working, and how we work. We got to figure out if that's all going to work together to do something that's feasible. Then the commission has to make findings that demand management activities are necessary. We're only doing this for compact compliance purposes. This is not a water bank that we're trying to set up just for the fun of it. This is only going to be used for if and when it's needed to comply with a compact. When do we need to trigger it so that it's useful? That's the kind of finding that the UCRC would need to make. The UCRC, the UCRC is the Upper Colorado River Commission, by the way, if that's an undefined term. The UCRC is going to have to consult with the lower basin states on terms of the Upper Basin program. That's one of the requirements that they're going to have in order to get their heads wrapped around us doing this. And we're also going to have to enter into agreements with the Secretary on how consumptive use would be verified, conveyed, accounted for, stored, all of those kind of things. And then the commission must formally approve the program, and each upper division state must also approve the program through its respective commissioner. If one of the commissioners does not approve the program, there's no program. It's a veto in the upper basin.
So if Colorado doesn't like the situation we're in, or the way the program has been set up, or anything really about the mechanism that you're talking about here, we would essentially have a veto.
Yep.
We could say we're not moving forward.
Correct.
Okay.
It's the only way. It's an all for one for all kind of thing in the upper basin, which we do frequently. So that's good. But if we don't like something, it's not going to happen. Other elements of the framework within which a demand management program could be developed are set forth here. They're highlighted because we've heard in some outreach and discussions that these are important to the upper basin, and they're also very important to the lower basin. That meaning, for water that's conserved to be part of a demand management program, it must be only done for the purposes of compact compliance. It must involve water that is either been imported from outside the system of the Colorado River Basin, or the consumptive use has that's been occurring in the basin under existing rights, and it must have been conserved specifically for the program. I kind of muffled that. What I'm trying to say is that the consumptive use within the basin had to have been occurring prior to it being conserved for compact compliance. It can't just all of a sudden one day, okay, I'm not using any water, but let me get credit for it and say we're conserving water. It needs to be physically available. You need to have been able to have access to divert the water in the year that you want to conserve it. And it needed to be available for beneficial and consumptive use within the upper basin, except for the fact that it's been decided that the conservation is going to occur, and then it will be folded into a demand management program. And then it needs to be accounted for and verified as conserved, conveyed, and stored for the demand management purposes. So those are key elements or parameters within which any demand management program in the upper basin needs to be developed. They're not the only ones. They're the minimum ones that basically the upper basin and lower basin needed to agree on in order to be able to secure the storage piece that we're looking for. The other element of it is water stored. Any conserved water, any water conserved under an upper basin demand management program is subject to evaporation. Everything we store is subject to evaporation. We're just being honest with what happens with water. Annual creation limits. So how much can we create and conserve in 1 year? There'll be a limit to that, and an overall maximum volume limitation of 500,000 acre feet between now and 2026. The lower basin wanted to know the parameters of the scope of what we were talking about between the interim period of now to 2026. So the maximum volume of conservation we can do under a program, if we have a program, is 500,000 acre feet. If for some amazing reason we have so much water that we're spilling out of Glen Canyon Dam, then we will have to reduce the amount of water we've conserved in our account. And that's the equivalent of what happens in the lower basin with their intentionally created surplus. If it's spilling from Lake Mead, they lose the water from their ICS on a pro rata basis. And then finally, all water that's stored in the facilities for a demand management program is going to be subject to annual verification and accounting. The last three on this slide are very important to us for the reasons that James kind of highlighted. Water stored under a demand management program, according to this agreement, will only be released at the request of the Commission to help assure compact compliance. It's not somebody picking up the phone going, oh, I really wish we had water for something, and somebody being able to get it. It's only for compact compliance. And as James just highlighted, it's not subject to coordinated operations of the Colorado River system. If that water is stored in Lake Powell, it's not going to do anything to increase releases from Lake Powell or decreases from Lake Powell that would have otherwise occurred except for that water being there. So it's the equivalent, it's not in the reservoir, basically, for purposes of looking how to operate the 07 guidelines. And the other thing is the agreement part of this, not the authorization part, but the agreement part sunsets in 2026. Well, if we've stored water and for the specific purpose of compact compliance, we don't want to lose it just come 2026. Similarly, the lower basin with their intentionally created surplus doesn't want to lose it in 2026. So we have this extended out provision that says any water we've stored between now and 2026 under a program is available for these specific purposes through 2057. And then the last part of this agreement is the post-2026 world. As I said a long time ago now, we have to renegotiate the 07 guidelines. They terminate in 2026. We start renegotiations in a year and a half. And so the thinking is anything that's happening after 2026, if we have a demand management storage program for that, it will be informed by and considered as part of that renegotiation process. But a lot of the conditions that we have or parameters that we've highlighted in this will probably extend out for our interest as well as the lower basin. So with that, got to see what the next slide is, I forget. So that's the upper basin tools. And then we have a significant lower basin element. And I'm going to be very honest with you. If you look at this document of the lower basin, it's weedy. It's very detailed. Unlike ours, that our documents and our tools are a plan. They set forth plans of how to respond if needed. This basically is a recipe for put this much, to put a teaspoon of this in, a tablespoon of that in, because this is exactly how we need to bake the cake right now. And so what we have here, I've worked in this for 13 years, and I have to tell you that it's very complicated to understand what's really going on with some of the elements of the lower basin drought contingency plan. We're protected in a number of ways, which I'll get to anyway. But so if you're reading it and confused, join the club is basically what I'm telling you. But we've asked a number of questions and secured a number of assurances in order to make sure that we feel protected. So that, and we're very encouraged by the efforts and work that they've done to be able to do what they're trying to accomplish. And what are they trying to accomplish? They're trying to find a way to conserve more water in Lake Mead to protect critical elevations in really dry times by also incentivizing and adding additional flexibilities to the operation. And I'll get to what that means. But their agreement is one agreement with an attached operations document. And the agreement sets the terms for the secretary and the lower basin entities to agree on the terms. It's the legalese of everything. And it includes a commitment by the Secretary of the Interior to work to create 100,000 acre-feet of water per year for the system in Lake Mead. And it ends in 2026. So this will all be subject to renegotiation of the 07 guidelines. The operations element of the document serves as guidance for the Bureau of Reclamation in combination with the 07 guidelines to control how operations will work in the lower basin. It requires each lower division state, Arizona, California, Nevada, and California, which is very significant, it includes California, to contribute specific volumes of drought contingency water to Lake Mead at certain elevations. And it recognizes that the drought contingency contributions may be created by converting that ICS or creating ICS, this banked water. But if they can't create that water, ICS, to get at it later, they still have to contribute DCP water. And that means they have to leave water in the reservoir and it's a shortage to them. It's incentivizing for them to be able to create DCP ICS, sorry for the acronyms, I know they're annoying, to create this drought contingency plan intentionally created surplus because they can get access to it later. It can be delivered to them when the conditions at Lake Mead have improved. Above elevation 1090, for example, for the DCP ICS. There are some temporary borrowing provisions in this document that they can get quick access, but they have to return it very quickly as well.
So Karen, just as we in the upper basin are creating a safe account to put water into if we so choose and create that water, they in the lower basin are also trying to create some more certainty and some more resiliency in how they store water in Lake Mead with this. Is that a safe?
Yes.
Is that a fair statement?
That's a very good summary, yes.
Okay.
And as I say, its overall goal is to force basically the lower basin to conserve water, and in order for them to agree to that forcing, they wanted the additional flexibility to accomplish it. So next slide will show you, it's draft because everybody hasn't inked anything, but these numbers have not changed very much, but this is just an idea of showing you what happens. The far left is under the 07 guidelines, how much water stays in Lake Mead, the shortages that Arizona and Nevada would be taking in addition to Mexico. Those are the volumes in the first three columns. Then we have the next set of columns for DCP contributions. That is Arizona, Nevada, and California. And you can see their contributions increase as the elevations of Lake Mead go down. So Arizona and Nevada start making contributions at elevation 1090, and those ratchet up all the way down to 1025. California starts contributing at elevation 1045, and those ratchet up down to 1025. And Mexico also has greater contributions as well. And then the next set of columns on the far right show basically the combined savings or conservation in Lake Mead as a result of those activities. And if Lake Mead is at elevation 1025, then the combined savings is 1.375 million acre-feet in that far right corner, bottom corner. So that's basically the conservation requirements that they're going to have to make through the life of the drought contingency plan through 2026. You can go to the next one. The other elements that they have, though, are the greater flexibility, how to incentivize creation, how they were willing to sign on to something like this, or may be willing to sign on to something like this. I've been referring to DCP ICS, the requirements of being able to contribute water under the drought contingency plan. Well, at the same time, the 07 guidelines will continue to operate, and they can bank water under specific conditions, the fallowing, canal lining, systems, conservations, those kind of things, and it's called ECICS. And they want to have more flexibility for creating that. And to do that, it would be, they can now access it below 1075. They can also, they aren't subject to this complicated type of assessment on an annual basis for evaporation losses and system assessments. They get a one-time evap hit when it's created. And then they also have a greater volume of their account, how much ICS they can create between now and 2026. And it may be delivered through 2057. And basically the last thing is that they've trying to work out an arrangement where one state, say for example, Arizona, can access ICS available capacity if California has availability in their capacity. Again, it's weedy, I know, but those were kind of the main flexibility components. From the upper basin's perspective, the fact that they are needing or wanting these are problematic to the law of the river. The 07 guidelines had specific criteria that we needed to follow. These changed some of them. And also the ability to access ICS below 1075, basically we, at least as lawyers, think that it violates the Boulder Canyon Project Act and the Arizona v. California decree. So it's changing the law. So it requires federal approval. And that's why we need federal legislation for the lower basin drought contingency operations. Then the final component of the drought contingency plan is already done. We signed it, we being the United States and Mexico, signed this in October of last year. And it is basically what Mexico, the important part for what we're talking about is that Mexico too has agreed to be able to share in the pain and is agreeing to take water scarcity efforts to add water to the system in Lake Mead at those specific elevations. The problem is that they're not going to do it unless we're all going to do it, unless the lower basin is going to do it. And so this has been being held in abeyance and is only triggered if the lower basin drought contingency plan becomes operational. So we can go to the next slide. So that's the lower basin and the Mexico plan. And if you go back to that graph, the crazy colors and everything, the companion agreement is what binds everybody together. As I had mentioned, it's going to be a document signed by the Secretary, the Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner, the upper and lower basin parties. It attaches and incorporates both of the drought contingency plans, the upper and the lower basin documents. And this is where I said, you know, there's a lot of complexity to the lower basin documents in our mind, and we're not sure how all of it will act, but we are guaranteed the ability to consult and discuss and work through a process with them as it's implemented. And that kind of thing is spelled out in the companion agreement, our consultation provision. They too get to ask consultation for all of our upper basin stuff as well, and we have to work through a process in order to address those consultation questions. We still all reserve our rights, we still all reserve our ability to do what we want to do and need to do under the law, but we'll just follow a process for addressing questions and concerns before having to go to court if we wanted to. And it serves as a mechanism to enforce the drought contingency plans against each other. So that's the final document. That package of documents then would be taken and given to the congressional delegations or committees, wherever they're going to be, to work through a vehicle to have it federally approved or federally acknowledged. And the goal for that is to authorize and direct the Secretary to execute the documents and implement the operations once all of the other parties execute the documents. And the reason we want that is otherwise we are at fear that somebody can unilaterally change the law of the river or going to operate in a way we don't agree with or aren't certain of, and it creates claims and controversies and basically invites the desire and need for litigation as opposed to working things out. And while I'm a lawyer, I will say that litigation with 7 states and the federal government with the Supreme Court is not advised. So working it out is, I think, the best way to go. So with that, we have a timeline of what we're trying to accomplish here. I mentioned that we have to start renegotiating the 07 guidelines beginning in 2020. If we don't have the drought contingency plan by that time, we're going to be negotiating too many things at the same time. So we're trying to accomplish this before that happens. And we have a short window of functionality, we think. So the operational, or the tentative, very fluid schedule for the timeline as of today is that we are doing outreach in October. Not just Colorado, all of the states and all of the entities are now starting their outreach. Finally, we have something to outreach about. We had a lot of things to get our heads wrapped around and working out with the lower basin on things. So between October and December, as boards and opportunities in the lower basin present themselves, they'll be seeking their lower basin approvals, and the upper basin through the commissioners and their outreach to their prospective constituencies will be doing their approval. Federal legislation is the wild card. Congress, as functional as it has been, needs to be able to get a heads up of what's coming. And so we need to start at least giving them a heads up sooner rather than later of what might come and what might not come and what the issues are. So that foundation might be starting here soon. And continue that process as needed with the hope for a legislative vehicle in late 2018 or early 2019. For Arizona to approve and be part of this whole thing, they need to have their legislature approve the documents as well in the lower basin. They don't come back into session until January, so the earliest likelihood that they're going to be able to formally approve everything is in 2019. We can test the waters and see where they're going and take their temperature before that and kind of predict, hopefully, that they're going to be on a track before that. But the formal approval will not be able to occur until at least January 2019. And then, and only then, after all of that, would there be an estimated time when the documents would be executed and put into operation. So that's for the Interstate Drought Contingency Planning Agreement. That is not the intrastate demand management, let's go set up a demand management program discussion. That is something each of the states are going to have to accomplish on their own and together And that is the outreach that we've been doing starting at the beginning of this year, and it's going to be an ongoing iterative process. And that's where I'm going to punt it to Becky.
Perfect.
James, before I do that, we weren't going to do it much Q&A, but there was a question that I think is, I'm going to broaden it from the whole social media chat going on while you guys are talking.
Great.
One of the questions that was asked, and I'll broaden a little bit, but does any of this require preparation of an EIS under NEPA? So for the upper basin materials, especially the drought response operations agreement, we have committed that we are working within the existing NEPA and ESA permitting. Okay, so for the upper basin, no. And for the lower basin, most of that, if not all of it, and Bob Snow would be able to, from the solicitor's office, would be able to better answer this, but it's working within the existing NEPA and ESA compliance for the 07 guidelines. We're not broadening it beyond that. To the extent there might be some questions on some things, they're doing additional kind of cursory reviews. I think it's under the Multi-Species Conservation Program, the MSCP, ESA kind of stuff for them. Now, California has their own environmental processes they have to go through, CEQA, and MWD and IID and Coachella and Palo Verde and all of them are working through that process as well.
Any other hot, burning questions?
Why don't you go ahead and move on, but we're a little tight on time there.
Excellent, yeah. Well, we were just transitioning to Becky Mitchell, the director of the Colorado Water Conservation.
Go back one slide. Sure. Thank you. So while this webinar was primarily focused on the interstate issues, we wanted to give just a little bit of information on some intrastate issues. So last week, the Colorado Water Conservation Board directed staff to begin a comprehensive outreach effort on demand management to stakeholders, water users, tribes, and water managers. This will begin later this year and continue on into next year. The outreach effort will allow staff and the board to identify and evaluate possible options for avoiding involuntary compact curtailment. Avoiding involuntary compact curtailment. I want to stress that. This is consistent with the water plan goal identified in Chapter 9.1 that states that the state will support strategies to maximize the use of compact water while actively avoiding a Colorado River compact deficit. This effort is serving two key purposes. The first being to examine demand management efforts as they are being assessed within Colorado, and the second to inform progress on both the interstate and intrastate fronts, and serve as an ongoing resource for Colorado water users. We want to make sure that our stakeholders are kept in the loop on conversations, as conversations evolve throughout the Colorado River Basin, on drought contingency planning and other initiatives that will affect Colorado water users. In pursuit of that goal, we've already begun traveling to speak to different stakeholder groups since January. Since then, just a few of the topics that we've provided information about are the compact specifically, the law of the river, some of the challenging hydrology, the ongoing drought contingency planning efforts, just to name a few. We've made it to just about all of the roundtables thus far, the West Slope and Front Range caucuses, and we have attended board meetings, seminars, and other water policy forums. These meetings have already been well attended, and the conversations and questions have been great. Our stakeholders already have a high level of awareness and knowledge about the challenges on the Colorado. It's been a good exercise all around for all of us to engage in these discussions and to hear directly from our water users about the challenges and opportunities that they identify in these ongoing efforts. The Water Conservation Board just last week gave us direction on the documents that James and Karen have covered here today. They directed us to continue outreach on the DCP and demand management. We'll kick that off this week with a presentation first in the Southwest Basin at the Roundtable in Durango tomorrow, and then to the Metro Roundtable in Denver on Thursday. Then the next week will be at the Interbasin Compact Committee and giving an update. And then on October 23rd, state staff will participate in a workshop in Grand Junction hosted by the Grand Valley Water Users Association. That is just this month. We are going to continue these efforts. The other part of the board's direction directly addresses the ongoing conversations regarding demand management. They directed staff very clearly to work on a policy statement for the board's consideration. A draft policy statement regarding Colorado River Basin demand management strategies within Colorado. The statement will take into consideration the challenges and opportunities that have been identified by our stakeholders as part of the outreach that we've already been conducting, including public comment at the Colorado Water Conservation Board meetings and letters that have been received by the board on the matter, or to the board by the matter, on the matter. The demand management storage agreement that James and Karen have discussed allows the state of Colorado to continue that public discussion about demand management, its feasibility, and how it could be operated in a way that protects existing uses in Colorado. All state efforts to this point with the UCRC and the intrastate stakeholders have been geared to assessing feasibility of a temporary, voluntary, and compensated scenario. This is consistent with state policy as adopted in Colorado's water plan, and we plan to continue to work with state stakeholders on how such a program could be operated. So with that said, our work continues. We look forward to continued work with our stakeholders and partners across the state. We're here for your questions and comments. In an effort to make sure that everyone benefits, we're asking that you send emailed questions, comments, or concerns to Brent Newman at brent.newman@state.co.us. That way we can publish those comments and questions and concerns on our CW website along with the responses. I think that that provides an opportunity for everyone to kind of see how we've handled things. With that being said, you can move on to the next slide. I think all of us here want to thank you. First of all, the stakeholders across the state, but there are tireless efforts happening both in the state, at the state staff level, but across the state as stakeholder groups, with stakeholder groups. So that's all I have to say. James, Karen, anything else that you want to?
Yeah, in concluding, I echo Becky in her sentiments. I think I will set the record straight because I know that this is being recorded for posterity, that I think there was a mention of Congress being effective or at least not dysfunctional. And I want to make sure that people understand we have a very good view from our seat. This is the same view you have from yours, and that is we don't know what Congress is going to move forward in terms of vehicles in the coming sessions. But we are optimistic that if we have our house in order and our legislation drafted, that we will be able to move when we get that opportunity. Again, I'll draw your attention to that slide that has Brent Newman's address on it. Feel free, that can be our clearinghouse, our one-stop shop for any comments or questions or observations you might have. But thank you again to Doug Kemper and the Colorado Water Congress for hosting us and this webinar. Incredible work. Thank you to Colorado. We are in amazing shape. No other state that, and I know we're biased, but we have 6 other contemporaries on this river, and no other state has as many voices that are as engaged and educated about these issues as Colorado does, that speaks with one voice. And it's a huge testament to Colorado's water community and the stakeholders and just the normal citizens that are on these calls and these webinars. So thanks to that, thanks to the state team. Karen Kwan's been doing amazing work. Becky Mitchell at the CWCB, Brent Newman also at the CWCB. The state team's been amazing on all of this. So thanks, that's it for now, and we'll circle back when we have something else to report. Thanks, Doug.
Great. Thank you, James. And we had 257 people at peak on this call, which is like a new record for us by a factor of 2, which is phenomenal. And we want to thank the CWCB for putting the information out here for us. I think it's just fantastic. We're working with new technology here, Zoom, and we've generally been getting good comments on it. going on the side bar here. So hopefully we'll continue with that platform. So thanks again for doing this with us.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, for those of you on the phone, we're going to sign out, and thank you for being on the call.